What would you do if a single night in a stranger's home revealed a secret powerful enough to destroy respected lives? Yet repeating it would only hurt the innocent? One exhausted traveler found himself standing at the door of a modest country house during a violent storm. He asked for nothing more than shelter until morning. But before the sun rose, he overheard a conversation that changed everything he believed about the people around him. The remarkable part isn't what he discovered. It's the reason he chose to keep that secret for the rest of his life. The entire hall fell into complete silence the moment Samuel Briggs pulled back the heavy oak chair and invited the weary traveler to sit among nobles and distinguished guests. Candlelight danced across polished silver and crystal glasses, reflecting puzzled expressions from every corner of the room. His clothes were plain, still carrying traces of mud from the previous night's storm. Yet there was something about the calm confidence in his posture that made even the proudest men hesitate before judging him. No one present could explain why the room suddenly felt different, simply because one quiet stranger had crossed its doors. What none of them realized was that only hours earlier, this same man had spent the night beneath the roof of an honest farmer, who had welcomed him without asking for his name, his fortune, or the title he had deliberately chosen to hide. During that single night, hidden behind old wooden walls and dim lantern light, he had overheard a conversation that could have destroyed powerful lives, shattered respected reputations, and forever changed the future of an entire community. Yet the words he heard would remain locked inside his heart until the end of his days. Before we uncover how an ordinary night became the beginning of an unforgettable story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Here, we share stories about kindness, justice, and unexpected moments that remind us how a single decision can change countless lives. Now, let's return to the beginning, where none of this seemed possible. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. Stories like this remind us that kindness, integrity, and quiet courage often change lives in ways we never expect. If you enjoy meaningful stories with unforgettable endings, you're in exactly the right place. Rain had been falling relentlessly for hours. The narrow country road had become little more than a river of mud, while fierce winds bent ancient trees until their branches nearly touched the soaked ground. Every distant thunderclap echoed across the valley, making the horses abandoned beside a broken carriage grow increasingly restless. Having dismissed his attendants earlier that afternoon, he had chosen to travel alone after months spent visiting rural estates in disguise, believing that people revealed their true character only when they thought no privilege stood before them. He now walked through the storm carrying only a leather satchel and an unshakable sense of purpose. After miles of exhausting silence, a faint amber glow appeared beyond a line of oak trees. It came from a modest farmhouse, whose windows radiated warmth into the freezing night. Thin streams of smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, while the comforting scent of freshly baked bread drifted into the rain-soaked air. For the first time in hours, Adrian Ashcroft slowed his pace, studying the peaceful home before him. It was neither grand nor wealthy, but it possessed something far rarer, a feeling of genuine welcome. He approached the wooden gate without knowing that fate had already chosen this place long before he arrived. Had he continued another mile down the road, none of what followed would ever have happened. There is one small detail about that decision that will only make sense much later in this story, and once you notice it, everything else will fall perfectly into place. The heavy oak door opened almost immediately after Adrian Ashcroft knocked. Standing beneath the warm glow of an oil lantern was a gray-haired gentleman whose face carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life treating others with fairness. He noticed the stranger's soaked clothes, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the cold rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Yet instead of asking questions, he simply stepped aside with a welcoming smile. "You look like you've had a difficult journey," the older man said gently. "Please, come inside before this weather steals whatever strength you have left." The traveler crossed the threshold, instantly greeted by the comforting warmth of a crackling fireplace. The rich aroma of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and herbs filled the air, replacing the damp scent of rain that clung to his coat. Everything about the modest home reflected care rather than wealth. Worn wooden furniture had been polished with love, embroidered curtains framed each window, and every object seemed to carry the memory of hands that valued usefulness over luxury. Without realizing it, Adrian Ashcroft had entered one of the rarest places a man could ever find, a house where kindness was offered before judgment. After supper, the older gentleman offered Adrian Ashcroft a comfortable guest room overlooking the orchard behind the house. It was simple, furnished with little more than a sturdy bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a small writing desk positioned beside a narrow window. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass, while the fire downstairs slowly settled into glowing embers. The house grew peaceful as every member of the family retired for the night. The traveler carefully removed a leather wallet from inside his coat. Hidden within it rested a finely engraved signet ring, bearing the emblem of one of the kingdom's oldest noble families. He looked at it for several silent seconds before placing it back into the pocket without wearing it. Revealing who he truly was would immediately change the way everyone behaved around him. Gratitude born from admiration meant very little to him. Genuine character could only be discovered when people believed they had nothing to gain. Instead of sleeping, he sat quietly beside the window, watching rainwater slide across the glass while reflecting on the remarkable generosity he had witnessed. Very few people would have welcomed a complete stranger during such a violent storm. Fewer still would have done so without expecting anything in return. He had intended to continue his journey at dawn, never seeing this family again. But before sunrise, something would happen inside that peaceful house that would make leaving impossible. The answer to everything was closer than anyone imagined. Early the next morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the fields, Clara Whitmore of the house quietly entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast alongside her father. She expected their guest to remain asleep after such an exhausting journey, yet she found him already outside drawing fresh water from the old stone well. His movements were calm and practiced, performed without hesitation or complaint, as though hard work had never been beneath him. She watched discreetly through the window, puzzled by the contradiction before her eyes. His clothes suggested an ordinary traveler, but everything else told a different story. His posture remained naturally dignified, his speech was unusually refined, and even the way he thanked the stable hand for lending him a bucket carried an effortless grace that could never be learned overnight. There was discipline in every gesture, but not the slightest trace of arrogance. Curiosity slowly replaced suspicion. Throughout breakfast, she noticed how carefully he listened whenever someone spoke, never interrupting and never attempting to impress anyone with stories about himself. Most travelers loved speaking about their adventures. This man preferred asking questions about the family, the harvest, and the nearby villages instead. Without realizing it, she had begun observing someone who had spent years learning that true influence was often exercised through silence rather than words. At this point, everything still seems ordinary. But hidden behind the peaceful routine of this family is a detail that almost everyone overlooks. That single detail will soon expose a deception years in the making, and when it finally comes to light, nothing inside this house will ever be the same. Breakfast was served on a solid wooden table that had belonged to the family for generations. Fresh bread still carried the comforting warmth of the oven, homemade butter slowly melted across its golden crust, and fragrant herbal tea filled simple ceramic cups. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating tiny particles of flour floating peacefully in the air, while birds greeted the morning from the orchard outside. The traveler noticed that the oldest servant quietly waited until everyone else had begun eating before reaching for his own plate. Without making the gesture seem important, the guest stood, sliced another loaf of bread, and served the elderly man himself before returning to his seat. The room fell briefly silent. No wealthy merchant, visiting official, or passing noble had ever treated the servants as equals inside that house. Yet this stranger behaved as though such courtesy required no recognition at all. The father exchanged a thoughtful glance with his daughter, but said nothing. Acts of kindness often revealed far more about a person's upbringing than expensive clothes or impressive titles ever could. None of them understood why Adrian Ashcroft seemed so different from every distinguished guest they had hosted in the past. Even he could not imagine that before another night had passed, those same quiet virtues would place him at the center of a secret that would test every value he believed in. The peaceful rhythm of the morning was interrupted by the sound of carriage wheels crunching across the gravel path. Moments later, a finely dressed gentleman stepped down with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His tailored coat, polished boots, and expensive gloves immediately distinguished him from everyone else on the property. Even before he spoke, the servants exchanged uneasy glances, silently recognizing the arrival of the estate's financial administrator. "Good morning," he announced with a courteous smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I hope I haven't arrived at an inconvenient moment. There are a few important documents that require your immediate attention." His tone remained perfectly polite, yet beneath every carefully chosen word lingered an unmistakable expectation that no one would dare refuse his request. The father welcomed him respectfully, unaware that Adrian Ashcroft quietly observed every detail from the porch, saying nothing while carefully studying the newcomer's behavior. The administrator barely acknowledged the servants, ignored the guest entirely, and walked inside as though the house belonged to him. To most people, his confidence appeared reassuring. Behind him walked a Thomas Hale carrying several leather folders against his chest. Unlike his employer, he spoke to no one. His lowered eyes and nervous expression suggested he was witnessing far more than he wished to remember. To Adrian Ashcroft, however, it felt strangely rehearsed. Years of experience had taught him that true authority rarely needed to announce itself so loudly. There was something hidden beneath the man's polished manners, and before the day was over, the first cracks in that carefully crafted image would begin to appear. Throughout the afternoon, Edmund Blackwood spoke at length about delayed payments, disappointing harvests, and contracts that supposedly demanded urgent signatures. Every explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, supported by neatly organized ledgers and official-looking correspondence. Anyone listening casually would have accepted every word without hesitation. Yet Adrian Ashcroft noticed something almost invisible. Each conversation subtly pushed Elias Whitmore toward decisions that benefited only one person. Whenever the older gentleman asked for clarification, Edmund Blackwood answered with excessive confidence, redirecting the discussion before uncomfortable questions could be explored. He praised the family's honesty, while quietly suggesting that recent financial difficulties left them with very few alternatives. Every compliment concealed another layer of pressure. Every reassurance narrowed the choices available. It was not force that he used. It was manipulation refined through years of practice. Standing near the stable while pretending to repair a loose saddle strap, Adrian Ashcroft overheard fragments of these conversations carried by the afternoon breeze. His expression never changed, but his attention sharpened with every passing minute. He had encountered ambitious men before, Yet something about this situation felt different. There was a pattern emerging that no one else inside the house seemed able to recognize. And if his growing suspicion proved correct, the greatest danger had not yet revealed itself. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, Elias Whitmore excused himself from the sitting room and disappeared into his small study at the end of the hallway. The room had remained almost untouched for years. Shelves filled with aging books lined the walls, while neatly folded maps and property records rested beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp. Outside, the wind had calmed, allowing the peaceful sounds of birds settling into the orchard to replace the violence of the previous night's storm. Believing himself to be alone, he unlocked an old wooden cabinet and carefully removed a leather folder worn by decades of use. His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside were unpaid accounts, letters from creditors, and legal documents carrying seals that had begun to fade with time. He quietly rubbed his forehead before whispering to himself, "If only there were another way." The burden he carried had never been shared with his daughter. He refused to let her worry about problems that he believed were his responsibility alone. Standing just outside the open window while admiring the garden, Adrian Ashcroft unintentionally caught fragments of the older man's quiet words. He immediately looked away, unwilling to invade another man's privacy. Yet what little he had heard confirmed something important. The family's difficulties were far greater than anyone at the dinner table had allowed themselves to admit. Still, there remained one question without an answer. If Elias Whitmore was such an honest man, why did Edmund Blackwood seem so eager to rush every decision? As sunset painted the horizon with shades of amber and crimson, Edmund Blackwood requested another private meeting before returning to town. The father reluctantly agreed, leading him toward the library while asking the servants not to disturb them. The heavy oak door closed behind them, but age had left narrow gaps between the wooden panels, allowing faint voices to drift into the otherwise silent corridor. The traveler happened to be passing through the hallway on his way back from the stable when he heard only scattered pieces of their discussion. "The deadline cannot be delayed," one voice insisted. "There are signatures still missing," came another. Although the complete conversation remained impossible to hear, the tone alone spoke volumes. What should have sounded like a professional discussion instead carried the unmistakable tension of someone applying pressure behind carefully chosen words. Just as Adrian Ashcroft considered quietly walking away, footsteps echoed across the corridor. The daughter approached carrying a tray with fresh tea, causing both men inside the library to stop speaking instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. She gently knocked, entered with a warm smile, and found both gentlemen behaving as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the brief exchange of nervous glances between them planted the first seed of doubt in her mind. There was something hidden inside that room, and before the next sunrise, the truth would begin revealing itself in the most unexpected way. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support allows us to continue bringing you powerful stories filled with justice, compassion, and unforgettable twists. Now, let's discover what happened during the darkest hours of that unforgettable night. Long after the lamps had been extinguished and the household had surrendered to sleep, Adrian Ashcroft remained awake. The silence inside the farmhouse was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an old grandfather clock downstairs and the occasional crackle from the dying embers in the fireplace. Moonlight filtered through the narrow window of his room, casting pale silver lines across the wooden floor. Unable to rest, he stepped quietly into the hallway, hoping the cool night air would settle the uneasy feeling that had followed him since Edmund Blackwood's arrival. As he approached the staircase, unfamiliar voices drifted through the darkness. They were low and cautious, coming from behind the study door that had been left almost completely closed. Instinctively, he stopped. He had no intention of listening to another man's private affairs, but the unmistakable tone of urgency rooted him to the spot. Every sentence was spoken in whispers, as though both men feared even the walls might betray them. "He must never discover the original agreement," one voice murmured. "If he delays signing until next week, everything falls apart," another replied. The traveler frowned. Those words alone revealed very little, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of deception. There was no anger, no argument, only the calm confidence of people who believed their plan was unfolding exactly as intended. What happened during the next few minutes would change everything he believed about Edmund Blackwood, and force him into a decision that would test both his wisdom and his integrity. Remaining perfectly still, hidden within the shadows of the corridor, Adrian Ashcroft continued hearing fragments of the conversation through the narrow opening beneath the door. The administrator's voice became clearer as he lowered his guard, convinced everyone in the house was asleep. "The old man still believes those debts are genuine," he whispered with quiet satisfaction. "Once the estate becomes collateral, transferring ownership will be nothing more than a formality. By the time anyone notices the discrepancies, the land will already belong to our investors." Another man gave a nervous laugh. "And his daughter? She will have no choice. Without the estate, she loses everything. She'll accept whatever arrangement is offered." The traveler's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Years of responsibility had taught him that the most dangerous moments demanded the calmest minds. He now understood the true purpose behind Edmund Blackwood's relentless pressure. This was never about helping an honorable family recover from financial hardship. It was a carefully constructed scheme designed to steal generations of honest work through forged documents and manufactured debt. Yet one detail disturbed him even more. The conspirators spoke with absolute certainty, as though someone inside the legal offices was already helping them. That single realization transformed a local fraud into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Now Adrian Ashcroft knows far more than he ever expected. But knowing the truth is only the beginning. The real question is whether revealing it immediately would save this family, or destroy their only chance of justice. You'll understand why he remained silent very soon. The traveler quietly stepped away from the study door, making certain that not even the floorboards betrayed his presence. He returned to his room with measured steps, closed the door without a sound, and sat beside the window overlooking the moonlit orchard. Most men, after uncovering such a conspiracy, would have confronted the culprits immediately or awakened the household without hesitation. He did neither. Instead, he folded his hands together and stared into the darkness, allowing every word he had overheard to settle before deciding his next move. Experience had taught him a lesson that countless honorable people learned too late. Exposing a lie without undeniable proof often strengthened the liar instead of protecting the innocent. If he accused Edmund Blackwood now, the forged documents would disappear before sunrise, the hidden accomplices would vanish, and the entire scheme would simply move somewhere else. Worse still, Elias Whitmore might be branded as a desperate debtor inventing accusations to escape his obligations. Justice achieved through impatience rarely remained justice for long. So he made a difficult promise to himself. He would not repeat what he had heard. Not until the truth could stand on its own, supported by evidence that no court, magistrate, or witness could deny. It was a painful decision, because every hour of silence placed the family closer to the trap being prepared for them. Yet he believed that protecting innocent people required more than courage. It required wisdom. There was one final piece missing, and until he found it, speaking too soon could destroy everything he hoped to save. At first light, The household slowly came back to life after the restless night. Dew sparkled across the gardens, birds filled the orchard with cheerful songs, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the open kitchen windows. Dew sparkled across the gardens, birds filled the orchard with cheerful songs, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the open kitchen windows. To everyone else, the farmhouse had returned to its usual peaceful routine. Only Adrian Ashcroft carried the weight of secrets gathered during the night, carefully hiding every sign of concern behind the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. While helping her father organize several old account books, the young woman noticed Adrian Ashcroft quietly examining a faded land survey that had been spread across the dining table. Without touching it, he politely pointed toward a boundary line drawn decades earlier and asked an unexpected question. "Has this section always belonged to your family?" Her father looked surprised. "It has, for nearly 70 years. Why do you ask?" The traveler smiled politely before replying. "Because whoever prepared the newer records seems to have ignored this original measurement." The room fell silent for a brief moment. The observation was remarkably precise, the kind that would normally come from an experienced surveyor, lawyer, or noble landowner, not from a weary traveler claiming to be passing through the countryside. The daughter looked at him with growing curiosity. It was becoming increasingly difficult to believe that chance alone had brought such an extraordinary man to their doorstep. Still, she resisted asking questions. Deep inside, she sensed that the answers would arrive when the time was right. And when they did, nothing in their lives would ever be the same. If stories about honor, hidden identities, and unexpected justice inspire you, make sure you're subscribed before we continue. Every week we bring new stories that prove the smallest acts of kindness can change countless lives. Now the story reaches the point where every decision begins to matter. The rest of the morning unfolded with remarkable calm. Yet Adrian Ashcroft saw the estate differently now. What had first appeared to be an ordinary countryside property slowly revealed subtle inconsistencies that most visitors would never notice. Account books were carefully arranged but contained figures that seemed strangely disconnected from the harvest the fields could realistically produce. Storage barns stood nearly full, while official records suggested disappointing seasons year after year. None of these details proved wrongdoing on their own, but together they painted a picture that refused to make sense. Later that afternoon, Elias Whitmore invited his guest to walk through the vineyards that stretched beyond the orchard. The warm summer breeze carried the scent of ripening grapes and wild lavender, while bees drifted lazily between rows of flowering herbs planted to protect the crops. The older man proudly explained how every acre had been cultivated by his family for generations, describing difficult winters, prosperous summers, and years when neighbors had helped one another survive poor harvests. His words reflected honesty, but they also revealed complete trust in the people responsible for managing the estate's legal affairs. As they returned toward the farmhouse, Adrian Ashcroft noticed fresh survey stakes driven into the ground near the eastern boundary. Their placement immediately caught his attention. They did not match the original measurements he had examined that morning. Someone had quietly begun redefining property lines long before any legal transfer had taken place. It was a small alteration, almost impossible for an untrained eye to detect, but it confirmed his growing suspicion. This deception had not been created overnight. It had been carefully built over many months, perhaps even years, by people who believed no one would ever examine the details closely enough to uncover the truth. Confident that every obstacle had already been removed, Edmund Blackwood returned to the estate before sunset, carrying another collection of neatly prepared documents. His smile appeared warmer than before, his voice even more reassuring. and every gesture projected the image of a man devoted to protecting the family's interests. To anyone watching from a distance, he looked like a trusted advisor offering help during difficult times. Only Adrian Ashcroft recognized the dangerous confidence hidden beneath that polished exterior. During supper, Edmund Blackwood carefully guided every conversation towards the estate's financial situation. He praised Elias Whitmore's integrity, spoke sympathetically about the challenges facing landowners across the region, and repeatedly emphasized how fortunate it was that a practical solution had already been prepared. He never demanded immediate signatures. Instead, he allowed silence and uncertainty to do the work for him, knowing that exhausted people often accepted unfair agreements simply to end their worries. The traveler listened without interrupting, paying closer attention to what remained unsaid than to the polished speeches themselves. Every carefully chosen sentence revealed another layer of Edmund Blackwood's strategy. He genuinely believed the outcome was already secured. He could not imagine that a quiet stranger sitting only a few feet away had begun assembling the scattered pieces of a much larger puzzle. Nor did he realize that one unexpected act of kindness, still waiting to happen, would soon alter the course of every plan he had so patiently constructed. Later that evening, Edmund Blackwood climbed into his carriage with complete confidence. As the horses pulled him away from the estate, he leaned back with a satisfied smile. In his mind, the farmhouse, the vineyards, and every acre of land already belonged to him. He had no idea that every mile carrying him away from the family was also carrying him closer to his own downfall. The administrator believes victory is already guaranteed. What he doesn't realize is that one unexpected act of kindness is about to change the course of every plan he has spent months building. And when that moment arrives, there will be no turning back. Early the next morning, while everyone believed the matter had settled for the day, Adrian Ashcroft quietly returned to the eastern boundary of the estate. A thin layer of mist covered the vineyards, softening the outlines of the hills beyond the estate. The cool air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, while the first birds cautiously welcomed the new day from the orchard. To anyone watching from a distance, he appeared to be doing nothing more than enjoying the peaceful countryside. In reality, every step he took had a purpose. He returned to the eastern boundary, where he had noticed the recently placed survey stakes. Kneeling beside one of them, he carefully compared its position with the landmarks described in the original survey he had memorized the day before. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. Whoever had ordered the new measurements had intentionally shifted the property line, creating the illusion that a valuable section of land legally belonged elsewhere. He neither removed the markers nor disturbed the ground. Instead, he quietly noted every discrepancy, understanding that evidence remained strongest when left exactly as it had been found. Before returning to the house, he stopped near the old stone bridge that connected the estate to the neighboring village. There he unexpectedly met an elderly mason repairing a damaged wall. Their brief conversation revealed something Adrian Ashcroft had not anticipated. The old craftsman casually mentioned seeing surveyors working on the estate months earlier, long before the family had ever spoken publicly about financial difficulties. That single remark transformed suspicion into certainty. The deception had been carefully planned from the very beginning, and someone had ensured every piece was already in place before the victims even realized they were being targeted. Later that afternoon, Edmund Blackwood returned carrying a polished leather portfolio secured with brass clasps. Inside rested the final contracts he had been urging Elias Whitmore to sign. He spoke with practiced confidence, explaining that delaying the agreement any longer might expose the estate to even greater financial risk. Every sentence sounded reasonable, every document appeared properly prepared, and every official seal looked perfectly authentic. To an honest man already burdened by uncertainty, Refusing such advice felt increasingly difficult. The father asked for a few moments alone before making his decision. Carrying the portfolio into his study, he closed the door behind him and sat quietly at his desk. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the worn surface where generations of his family had managed the estate with honesty and care. A few moments earlier, Edmund Blackwood had made one final attempt to pressure him. "Sign today," he insisted calmly. "You can still avoid losing everything." The father slowly closed the document and looked him straight in the eyes. "If losing this estate is the price of keeping my honor, then I will gladly lose the land before I ever sell my conscience." For the first time, Edmund Blackwood had no immediate answer. His fingers rested upon the unsigned papers, but instead of reaching for the pen, he opened a small framed photograph of his late wife. For several silent moments, he simply looked at her smiling face. "I promised I would protect everything we built," he whispered softly. Outside the slightly open window, Adrian Ashcroft happened to be crossing the courtyard after helping one of the stable hands repair a loose gate. Hearing only those few heartfelt words, he instinctively slowed his pace before continuing on without stopping. He had no desire to intrude upon another man's private grief, yet the quiet determination in Elias Whitmore's voice strengthened his own resolve. This was no longer merely about exposing fraud. It had become a matter of protecting a legacy built through decades of integrity. And very soon, an unexpected act of kindness from Elias Whitmore himself would give Adrian Ashcroft the final reason he needed to reveal just enough of the truth. Without ever repeating the secret conversation he had overheard that unforgettable night. Early the following morning, sunlight poured gently across the estate, warming the dew that still clung to the grass, while the fragrance of blooming roses drifted through the open windows of the farmhouse. It seemed like an ordinary day, yet Adrian Ashcroft could not shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had already gathered enough pieces of the puzzle to expose the deception, but he still questioned whether revealing himself was truly the right course of action. His journey had never been about recognition, and he intended to leave as quietly as he had arrived. As he prepared to continue on his way, Elias Whitmore approached him carrying a neatly wrapped bundle. Inside were fresh bread, smoked cheese, dried fruit, and a thick wool blanket carefully folded by his daughter. Embarrassed by the generosity, Adrian Ashcroft politely declined. "I have already accepted more kindness than I deserve." The older man smiled warmly and gently placed the bundle back into the visitor's hands. "Then allow me one more act of kindness. A traveler should never leave a home, wondering whether he was a burden. You arrived here as a stranger, but you leave as a welcome guest. We may never meet again, and that is precisely why helping one another matters." Those simple words struck Adrian Ashcroft more deeply than the man could possibly have imagined. Throughout his life, he had attended magnificent banquets, negotiated with influential statesmen, and received elaborate displays of respect from people seeking favors. Yet none of those moments carried the sincerity contained in that quiet farewell. For the first time since arriving, he realized that this family's generosity had never depended on who they believed he was. They would have shown the same compassion to anyone standing at their door. In that instant, he made a silent decision. He would protect them, not because of his position or authority, but because genuine goodness deserved someone willing to stand beside it. Just as Adrian Ashcroft prepared to mount his horse, hurried footsteps echoed across the courtyard. One of the youngest clerks employed by Edmund Blackwood came running through the front gate, his face pale with anxiety. Clutched tightly against his chest was a sealed envelope bearing no official crest. He stopped only after catching his breath, constantly looking over his shoulder as though afraid someone had followed him. "I was told to burn this," Thomas Hale admitted in a trembling voice. "But after everything I've seen, I couldn't do it." The father looked at him in confusion, while Adrian Ashcroft remained completely silent. The envelope was carefully opened, revealing several handwritten letters and an earlier draft of one of the estate contracts. Unlike the polished version Edmund Blackwood had presented only hours before, this document still contained corrections, erased figures, and notes exposing deliberate alterations to property boundaries and debt calculations. More importantly, one forgotten signature connected the forged agreement to another influential office within the county. It was the first piece of physical evidence that could not be explained away as misunderstanding or coincidence. The daughter quietly stepped forward and placed the family's oldest survey books on the table. "Father, these markings look familiar," she said softly. She remembered helping him organize the archives years earlier and immediately recognized several original boundary measurements. As everyone compared the old records with the newly discovered documents, another inconsistency became impossible to ignore. Without realizing it, her memory had uncovered yet another piece of Edmund Blackwood's deception. The traveler glanced briefly at the documents before stepping back, allowing Elias Whitmore to examine them himself. This discovery did not reveal everything Adrian Ashcroft knew, nor did it require him to repeat the conversation he had overheard during the night. Instead, the truth had begun emerging through its own evidence, exactly as he had hoped. The conspiracy was no longer built upon whispers hidden behind closed doors. It now rested upon ink, signatures, and documents that even the most skilled deceiver would struggle to deny, and somewhere beyond the estate, Edmund Blackwood remained completely unaware that the foundation of his carefully constructed scheme had just begun to collapse. News spread through the neighboring villages far more quickly than anyone expected. By midday, quiet whispers had begun replacing polite greetings in the marketplace. Farmers who had worked near the eastern boundary remembered seeing unfamiliar surveyors months earlier. A retired notary recalled reviewing an unusual request involving property maps that had never reached the official archives. Individually, none of these memories seemed important. Together, they formed a chain of events that pointed toward a carefully orchestrated deception. When Elias Whitmore invited several respected members of the community to the estate that afternoon, he expected little more than advice. Instead, each visitor unknowingly carried another missing piece of the puzzle. One elderly shepherd described markers being moved after sunset. A carpenter remembered repairing storage boxes filled with legal records that had mysteriously disappeared a few weeks later. Even the village postmaster admitted delivering sealed correspondence to addresses that had nothing to do with the family's affairs. None of them realized how valuable their observations had become until they heard one another speak. The traveler remained almost entirely silent throughout these conversations. Rather than directing the discussion, he allowed every witness to speak freely, carefully observing how their independent recollections naturally confirmed one another. Truth possessed a remarkable quality. Unlike lies, it rarely required rehearsal. Each honest testimony strengthened the next, until even those who had doubted Elias Whitmore's suspicions began to recognize the disturbing pattern unfolding before them. The administrator had believed he could manipulate documents forever, never imagining that ordinary people would become the strongest evidence against him. The following morning, a formal meeting was arranged inside the town's council chamber. Thick stone walls echoed with restrained conversation as respected landowners, legal advisors, merchants, and local officials gathered around a long walnut table polished by generations of public service. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating stacks of contracts, survey maps, and financial records placed neatly before the council. The administrator entered the room with the same composed confidence he had displayed since the beginning, convinced that nothing had changed. At first, everything unfolded exactly as he expected. He presented carefully prepared reports, explained the family's financial difficulties, and confidently recommended immediate approval of the transfer documents. Several council members nodded politely while reviewing the papers. Then, without warning, Elias Whitmore quietly produced the earlier draft recovered by Thomas Hale. A murmur spread across the chamber. The survey maps were placed side by side. Figures that had once appeared ordinary suddenly revealed deliberate alterations. Boundary lines no longer matched. Debt calculations had been quietly inflated. Signatures appeared where no authorization had ever been granted. No one spoke for several long seconds. One magistrate slowly removed his spectacles and leaned closer to the original survey maps. Another carefully traced each boundary with the tip of his finger, comparing every measurement against the recently submitted records. Quiet whispers spread across the chamber. Merchants exchanged uneasy glances, while several landowners shook their heads in disbelief. The silence carried more weight than any accusation ever could. One court officer examined every signature individually before passing the documents to the chief magistrate. The room remained completely still as each seal was carefully compared with the official registry. Finally, Thomas Hale stepped forward. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "These are the original drafts," he admitted. "I was ordered to destroy them." The administrator's confidence began to disappear. A bead of sweat slowly rolled down his temple as he realized every carefully hidden lie was now supported by undeniable evidence. The father watched the entire scene without speaking. He had spent months believing his own mistakes had placed his family in danger. Only now did he understand how completely he had been deceived. For the first time since arriving, Edmund Blackwood hesitated. It lasted only a heartbeat, but everyone in the room noticed. Witnesses who had remained silent until then began stepping forward one after another, calmly describing what they had seen over the previous months. No raised voices were necessary. No dramatic accusations were made. The facts themselves dismantled the carefully crafted illusion, piece by piece. Sitting quietly near the end of the table, Adrian Ashcroft watched in complete silence. The conversation he had overheard during that unforgettable night remained his secret alone. It no longer needed to be repeated. The truth had finally learned to speak for itself. The truth has finally reached the surface. But the greatest surprise isn't the nobleman's identity. It's the decision he makes after justice is served. A choice that no one in that room could have predicted, and one that reveals the true meaning of greatness. Stay with us until the very end, because the final lesson is the most powerful one of all. The council chamber remained completely still after the final witness finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the quiet traveler who had observed the proceedings from the far end of the table without offering a single unnecessary comment. Until that moment, he had appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary guest who had happened to accompany Elias Whitmore into town. Even Edmund Blackwood spared him little attention, convinced he posed no threat to carefully laid plans. One of the senior magistrates suddenly rose from his chair, his expression shifting from concentration to unmistakable surprise. He walked directly toward Adrian Ashcroft, stopped a respectful distance away, and bowed his head. "My lord, we did not expect your grace to arrive without notice." A wave of disbelief swept across the room. The traveler slowly stood, offering only a courteous nod in return. Without the muddy traveling coat that had concealed him since his arrival, the finely tailored garments beneath became visible for the first time. More importantly, he quietly removed the signet ring from his pocket and placed it upon the table. Its ancient crest was immediately recognized by every official present. The room that had moments earlier echoed with legal arguments now stood in absolute silence. The father stared in astonishment, while his daughter struggled to reconcile the humble guest she had shared breakfast with and the respected nobleman now standing before the council. Yet Adrian Ashcroft showed no trace of satisfaction. He had hidden his title because he wished to be judged as a man, not obeyed because of his rank. Color slowly drained from Edmund Blackwood's face as the realization settled upon him. He had spent 2 entire days dismissing Adrian Ashcroft as an insignificant stranger, speaking freely in his presence, underestimating both his intelligence and his influence. The confidence that had defined every movement since his arrival vanished almost instantly. For the first time, his carefully rehearsed composure abandoned him completely. He attempted to recover. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, forcing an uneasy smile. "Surely these conclusions have been reached too quickly." The nobleman looked at him calmly, his voice measured and remarkably gentle. "There is no misunderstanding. There are documents, witnesses, original surveys, and financial records that speak more clearly than either of us ever could." He never mentioned the conversation overheard during the night. He never repeated the whispers behind the study door or revealed that he had learned the truth long before the evidence appeared. He simply allowed the verified facts to stand on their own. The administrator finally understood the terrible mistake he had made. He had not been defeated by power, wealth, or authority. He had been defeated by patience. Had Adrian Ashcroft spoken too soon, the evidence might have disappeared forever. Instead, every lie had remained exactly where its author had left it, waiting for daylight to expose it before everyone. For several long moments, Elias Whitmore remained speechless. His eyes rested not on the ancient signet ring lying upon the council table, nor on the respectful bows now offered by magistrates and officials, but on the man he had welcomed into his home without asking a single question. Memories flooded back with astonishing clarity. The soaked traveler standing at his doorstep during the storm, the quiet conversations over breakfast, the simple acts of kindness shared around the table, and the humble gratitude shown for every small gesture of hospitality. Slowly, he rose from his chair. "I owe your grace an apology," he said sincerely. "Had I known who you truly were, I would have received you with the honor your station deserves." The nobleman smiled warmly and gently shook his head. "Then you would have treated my title, not my character." The words settled over the room with remarkable force. "You welcomed a stranger before you knew his name. You offered food before asking where I came from. You trusted a weary traveler without expecting anything in return. There is nothing for you to apologize for. On the contrary, it is I who leave your home indebted." The father's eyes grew moist, not because a nobleman had praised him, but because he finally understood what had truly happened. His greatest act had never been rescuing an important man from the storm. It had been proving that genuine kindness required no audience, no reward, and no promise of recognition. Without realizing it, he had given shelter to someone who could have demanded comfort anywhere in the kingdom, yet had chosen to seek the one thing that wealth could never guarantee, a home where goodness was offered freely. Within days, the investigation reached its conclusion. Every forged contract was declared invalid. The manipulated boundary markers were removed under official supervision, and the estate's original records were fully restored, according to the authentic surveys preserved in the county archives. The administrator was publicly removed from office, stripped of every legal privilege, and permanently forbidden from managing estates again. His reputation, built through years of deception, disappeared in a single afternoon. His closest accomplices faced legal judgment according to their involvement, while every fraudulent contract they had created was officially declared void. Justice arrived not through vengeance, but through lawful consequence, allowing the truth to repair what deception had nearly destroyed. The Thomas Hale, whose courage had preserved the original documents, was later offered a permanent position within the county records office. His honesty, shown during the most difficult moment of his life, earned the respect of everyone who had once overlooked him. From that day forward, his name became associated with integrity rather than fear. Many expected the nobleman to reward the family with vast sums of money or lavish gifts. Instead, he chose something far more meaningful. He established a permanent agricultural charter that protected the estate from future fraudulent claims, ensured that independent surveyors would oversee all boundary disputes, and created a scholarship allowing the children of local farming families to study law and land management. His reasoning was simple. If honesty must always depend on fortunate accidents, he told the council, then honest people will forever remain vulnerable. True justice builds protection for those who come after us. The father's family accepted the recognition with quiet humility. Their neighbors no longer admired them because they had unknowingly hosted a powerful nobleman. They admired them because they had treated a complete stranger with the very same generosity they would have shown anyone else. Their greatest reward was not wealth, influence, or prestige. It was the certainty that compassion had quietly changed lives far beyond anything they could have imagined on that rainy evening when someone knocked gently upon their door. Several weeks later, the estate had returned to its peaceful routine. The vineyards once again echoed with the laughter of workers. The orchards flourished beneath the warmth of early autumn, and every room of the old farmhouse seemed lighter than before. Visitors continued arriving from neighboring villages, not to witness scandal, but to congratulate the family whose honesty had become a source of quiet inspiration throughout the region. Life slowly found its natural rhythm again, as though the darkest days had been nothing more than a distant storm. Before departing, the nobleman requested one final private conversation with Elias Whitmore. They stood together beneath the old oak tree, overlooking the fields where everything had begun. The older man finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had lingered in his heart ever since the council meeting. "There is something I have never understood." The nobleman looked toward the horizon, where the golden light of sunset stretched across the vineyards. "You knew something before anyone else did, didn't you?" For a long moment, he remained silent. Then he smiled gently. "I knew enough to realize that speaking too early would have protected the guilty instead of the innocent." The father nodded, sensing there was more left unsaid. "You overheard something that night." The nobleman neither confirmed nor denied it. "Some truths," he replied softly, "are not forgotten because they lack importance. They are kept in silence because repeating them would reopen wounds that justice has already healed." He never explained further. The names of those who had secretly cooperated with Edmund Blackwood remained absent from every public conversation. Several had admitted their mistakes, returned what they had taken, and accepted the legal consequences without forcing innocent families to carry the shame of their actions forever. The nobleman believed that justice should restore what could still be restored, not endlessly multiply suffering after the truth had already prevailed. Months passed, yet the story of the mysterious traveler continued spreading from village to village. Every retelling emphasized different details. Some spoke of the nobleman who had hidden his title. Others remembered Elias Whitmore, whose generosity never depended upon wealth or reputation. Many admired the remarkable investigation that exposed corruption without violence or vengeance. Yet those who had truly witnessed the events understood that none of those things represented the heart of the story. The greatest lesson had unfolded on the very first night. An exhausted stranger had knocked on a simple farmhouse during a violent storm. No servant announced his arrival. No family crest introduced him. No title earned him respect before he crossed the threshold. He was welcomed because another human being chose compassion over suspicion. Everything that followed, the discovery of the conspiracy, the restoration of justice, the protection of the estate, and the recognition that transformed an entire community, had grown from that single decision made without expecting anything in return. As the nobleman's carriage disappeared beyond the hills for the final time, Elias Whitmore remained standing quietly beside the gate where he had first welcomed the weary traveler. He realized that he would probably never see him again, and somehow that no longer mattered. What remained would last far longer than any title, fortune, or public honor. Because in the end, the world doesn't remember those who constantly announce their greatness. It remembers those whose quiet acts of kindness continue changing lives long after their names have faded. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you won't miss future stories of courage, justice, and unexpected kindness. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever helped someone without knowing who they truly were, only to discover later that your kindness changed far more than you could have imagined?